DOJ investigation in Watts today after police shoot and kill a man there. It happened after the officers got a 911 call of an assault.
We're following breaking news in South LA, an officer-involved shooting.
It happened after the LAPD responded to reports of a man swinging a metal chain at cars. KTLA's Rich Brickett overhead in Sky 5. Hi, Rich.
1 in 25. That's your chance of becoming a violent crime victim if you live in Watts this year. Not in a decade, not over your lifetime, but in the next 12 months. We're talking about 3,670 violent crimes per 100,000 residents, which sits at 367% above the national average. To put that in perspective, you're almost 4 times more likely to experience violent crime here than in the average American neighborhood. Watts sits in South Los Angeles, stretching roughly between 103rd and 120th Streets along Avalon Boulevard. According to the latest LAPD CompStat data from 2024 and early 2025, this area consistently tops the charts for what law enforcement calls hood-specific violence. And yeah, we're talking about gang-related homicides, shootings, armed robberies, and aggravated assaults that happen with a frequency most Americans can't even imagine. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Los Angeles as a whole saw homicides drop by 14% in 2024. Violent crime across the city decreased by 9% in early 2025. The city is getting safer, right? Well, not if you live in Watts. While other neighborhoods celebrate declining crime rates, hotspots like Imperial Courts and Jordan Downs housing projects continue to see drive-by shootings and drug trafficking operations that keep residents on edge. The thing is, crime in LA is hyper-localized. Southeast Los Angeles, where Watts is located, records roughly 81,000 incidents annually. Meanwhile, places like Brentwood see fewer than 15,000. Same city, completely different realities. You could drive 15 minutes and go from one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in America to one where people leave their doors unlocked. So why does Watts specifically top the danger list? It beats out Skid Row, which has a 1 in 1 chance of victimization. It surpasses Compton, which has a violent crime rate of 620 per 100,000 residents. The difference comes down to the type of violence. Skid Row's numbers are inflated by assaults related to homelessness and drug overdoses. Watts' numbers reflect organized gang violence, territorial disputes, and retaliatory shootings that create a completely different threat landscape. When you break down what violent crime actually means here, you're looking at shootings that happen in broad daylight, armed confrontations over street corners that serve as drug markets, and a level of gang activity that has persisted for decades. The projects, the street corners, the intersections, each one tells a story of violence that residents have learned to navigate as part of daily life. August 1965. If you want to understand why Watts is what it is today, you have to go back almost 60 years to 5 days that fundamentally altered the trajectory of this neighborhood. The Watts uprising, or riots, depending on who you ask, left 34 people dead, over 1,000 injured, and thousands arrested. Property destruction was massive, and the scars never really healed. But here's what most people don't know. The uprising didn't come out of nowhere. Watts residents had been dealing with systematic police brutality, housing discrimination that packed Black families into specific areas, and unemployment rates that made finding legitimate work almost impossible. The spark that lit the fuse was a traffic stop, but the fuel had been building for years. The response from city and state governments set the stage for everything that followed. Instead of addressing the root causes, the discrimination, the lack of economic opportunity, the police violence authorities doubled down on surveillance and enforcement. More cops, more arrests, more confrontation. Businesses fled the area, taking jobs with them. Insurance companies redlined the neighborhood, making it nearly impossible for entrepreneurs to rebuild. The economic exodus was immediate and devastating. What came next was a generation of disinvestment. The uprising created a narrative that Watts was dangerous and unsalvageable, which became a self-fulfilling prophecy. When you remove economic opportunity from a community, when you flood it with police but not with resources, when you make it clear through policy that this neighborhood isn't worth investing in, you create the conditions for exactly the kind of violence we see today. The trauma didn't just affect the people who lived through 1965. It created generational patterns. Kids who grew up in the aftermath internalized a specific relationship with authority, distrust bordering on hostility. That distrust made community police cooperation almost impossible, which meant crimes went unsolved, which meant justice happened in the streets instead of courtrooms. By the 1972nd, street gangs began organizing in ways they hadn't before. The power vacuum left by legitimate institutions got filled by illegitimate ones. Crips and Blood sets proliferated, carving up Watts into territories that still exist today. The uprising didn't create gangs, but it created conditions where gangs could thrive and become the primary social structure for young men with no other options. So when you look at today's violence statistics, you're not just seeing current crime. You're seeing the compound interest on decisions made 60 years ago. Law enforcement estimates there are dozens of active gangs operating in Southeast LA, with at least 12 to 15 cliques specifically concentrated in the Watts area. And we're not talking about loose affiliations. These are organized groups with defined territories, hierarchies, and ongoing conflicts that span decades. The major players break down into familiar categories. You've got Grape Street Crips, Bounty Hunter Bloods, PJ Watts Crips, and multiple smaller subsets of both Crips and Bloods organizations. Then, you've got Latino crews operating in certain pockets. Each group controls specific blocks, housing projects, or corners. Imperial courts might belong to one set, while Jordan Downs is claimed by another. The 103rd Street area has different players than the territory around 120th. What makes Watts particularly volatile is the density. You can have 3 or 4 rival gangs operating within a few blocks of each other. That proximity creates constant friction. A perceived disrespect at a corner store, a social media post that mentions the wrong street, a girl dating someone from a rival set, any of these can trigger violence that escalates quickly. The conflicts here aren't always about the historic Crips versus Bloods rivalry. A lot of the feuds are hyper-local and retaliatory. One set feels disrespected by another. Someone gets shot, and then it's on. The retaliation might come days later or weeks later, but it comes. And then the cycle continues. With each generation inheriting beefs, they didn't start but feel obligated to continue. Drug territory plays a huge role too. Certain corners are known for moving product, and controlling those corners means money. When a new player tries to muscle in, or when one set tries to expand into another's territory, violence is the negotiation method. The LAPD's Gang Task Force has documented how these disputes over drug markets account for a significant percentage of shootings. What's evolved over the decades is the communication. Where previous generations relied on face-to-face confrontation, modern gang members use social media to track rivals, post disrespectful content, and even coordinate attacks. Instagram posts, Facebook arguments, and YouTube videos become evidence in murder investigations. The technology changed, but the underlying dynamics, respect, territory, retaliation, remained exactly the same. The Watts Gang Task Force, which has been operating since 2006, maintains intelligence on these groups and tries to mediate conflicts before they turn deadly. But with limited resources and deep-seated animosities, stopping every potential violent incident is impossible. Let's get specific about what 3,670 violent crimes per 100,000 residents actually means on the ground. That number includes homicides, aggravated assaults, armed robberies, and other violent offenses. When you break it down by time, you're looking at multiple violent incidents every single day in an area that's only a few square miles. The homicide rate specifically has seen fluctuations. While LA overall saw a 14% decrease in murders during 2024, certain LAPD divisions that cover Southeast LA, particularly the 77th Street and Southeast divisions, continue to report elevated numbers compared to citywide averages. The reduction is real, but it's not evenly distributed. Some neighborhoods got safer while Watts largely stayed the same. Now compare that to other notorious LA neighborhoods. Skid Row has a 1 in 10 chance of victimization, but most of that comes from assaults related to homelessness, drug activity, and mental health crises. It's a different threat profile. Compton, which has a reputation built over decades of rap lyrics and media coverage, sits at 620 violent crimes per 100,000, significantly lower than Watts. South Los Angeles broadly averages around 1,500 per 100,000. West Adams, which has seen some gentrification and investment, comes in around 1,200 per 100,000. What these numbers reveal is that Watts isn't just dangerous, it's an outlier even among dangerous neighborhoods. The concentration of gang-related violence, the frequency of shootings, and the retaliatory nature of many crimes create a unique environment. LAPD's CompStat data, which tracks crime by division and updates monthly, shows interesting patterns. Violent incidents cluster around specific times and locations. Late night and early morning hours see more activity. Certain intersections become hotspots. Housing projects like Imperial Courts and Jordan Downs consistently appear in incident reports. The GRYD zones, gang reduction and youth development areas, show more promising data. Neighborhoods that received focused intervention saw a 40% reduction in homicides. That's substantial. It suggests that targeted programs actually work when properly funded and implemented. But here's the problem. GRYD zones are limited in scope and budget. They can't cover all of Watts simultaneously, which means some blocks get intervention while others remain neglected. Property crime is also elevated, though it takes a back seat in public safety discussions. When you're worried about getting shot, car break-ins become secondary concerns. But the combination of violent and property crime creates an environment where legitimate businesses struggle to survive, which further limits economic opportunity. You can't talk about Watts' crime problem without talking about poverty. Over 30% of residents live below the poverty line. To put that in context, that's roughly triple the rate in many LA neighborhoods just a few miles away. When you combine that with an unemployment rate hovering around 15%, and that's just official unemployment, not counting people who've given up looking, you start to see why illegal economies become attractive. The median household income in the South Central LA area, where Watts sits, is dramatically lower than the county average. According to census data, many families survive on incomes that barely cover rent, let alone food, healthcare, or anything beyond basic survival. When legitimate work pays minimum wage for part-time hours with no benefits, and illegal work offers more money with flexible hours, the math becomes pretty straightforward for someone with bills to pay. Educational barriers compound the problem. Schools in Watts consistently rank among the lowest performing in the district. Graduation rates lag behind city averages. Access to college prep courses, AP classes, and the kind of counseling that helps kids navigate college applications, it's just not there at the same level as wealthier districts. So you've got kids growing up without the credentials or connections needed for professional careers. The concentration of public housing projects creates what sociologists call concentrated poverty. When you pack low-income families into specific geographic areas like Imperial Courts and Jordan Downs, you concentrate all the problems that come with poverty: limited job networks, reduced access to healthcare, food deserts, underfunded schools. The design of these projects, built decades ago, creates spaces that are easy for gangs to control and difficult for police to patrol effectively. Then there's the historical context of redlining and housing discrimination. Banks literally drew red lines around neighborhoods like Watts on maps and refused to provide mortgages or business loans in those areas. That was official policy for decades. Even after it became illegal, the effects persisted. Without access to capital, residents couldn't start businesses, couldn't buy homes, couldn't build generational wealth. The cycle becomes self-perpetuating. Poverty drives crime, crime drives away investment. Lack of investment perpetuates poverty. Businesses that might provide jobs either never open or leave after break-ins and robberies. The few that remain often operate behind bulletproof glass, creating a fortress mentality that further isolates the community. And here's something most people don't consider: the cost of being poor. Banking deserts mean residents pay fees to cash checks. Food deserts mean higher prices at corner stores than supermarkets. Lack of transportation means limited job access. Being poor is expensive, which makes escaping poverty even harder. The Guardian published detailed reporting in 2024 about something that doesn't show up in crime statistics: the impact of gun violence on children in South LA. We're talking about kids who've witnessed shootings before they hit puberty, who can identify different caliber gunshots by sound, who know to drop to the floor when they hear certain noises. That's not normal childhood development, that's training for a war zone. Exposure to violence at young ages creates what psychologists call complex trauma. It's not a single traumatic event, but chronic stress that fundamentally alters how a child's brain develops. Kids in Watts show higher rates of PTSD, anxiety disorders, and depression compared to children in safer neighborhoods. Their academic performance suffers because it's hard to focus on algebra when you're worried about getting shot walking home from school. The interruption to education goes beyond individual trauma. Schools in high crime areas deal with constant disruptions, lockdowns when violence happens nearby, students missing class because they're too scared to walk through rival gang territory, teachers burning out from the emotional toll of working in these conditions. The cumulative effect is an education system that can't function at the level needed to break cycles of poverty. Community-level PTSD is a real phenomenon. When entire neighborhoods experience ongoing violence, it creates collective trauma. Adults develop hypervigilance, constantly scanning for threats. Trust breaks down, not just trust in authorities, but trust between neighbors. The social fabric that holds communities together gets shredded by fear. Recent initiatives have tried to address this through a public health lens. Programs pair police with social workers and trauma counselors. When someone gets shot and survives, intervention teams work with them and their families to prevent retaliatory violence. The idea is to break the cycle at the moment it's most likely to continue. Hospital-based violence intervention programs have shown promise. Emergency room staff identify shooting victims who are at high risk of retaliation and connect them with counselors, job training, and mental health services. Early results suggest these interventions reduce repeat victimization, but they require sustained funding and coordination between hospitals, police, and community organizations. The Los Angeles Police Department's REACH teams represent another approach. These units combine traditional law enforcement with community health workers who can address trauma, connect families to services, and mediate conflicts before they turn violent. The model acknowledges that you can't arrest your way out of a public health crisis. But here's the harsh reality. These programs are underfunded and understaffed relative to the scale of need. There are thousands of trauma-exposed kids in Watts and only dozens of counselors trained to help them. The Watts Gang Task Force started in 2006 as a weekly meeting of people who normally don't sit in the same room. LAPD, brass gang, intervention workers, community leaders, service providers, and sometimes former gang members who've transitioned to prevention work. The idea was simple: coordinate responses, share intelligence, and try to prevent violence before it happens, rather than just responding after the fact. These weekly sessions review recent incidents, identify potential flashpoints, and mobilize resources. If intelligence suggests a specific conflict is about to escalate, the task force can deploy mediators, increase police presence, or connect at-risk individuals to services. It's not perfect, but it represents sustained effort over nearly 2 decades to bring different sectors together. The GRYD program, Gang Reduction and Youth Development, takes a different approach. Instead of focusing primarily on enforcement, GRYD zones fund violence interruption specialists, who are often former gang members with credibility on the streets. These credible messengers can mediate disputes that police can't touch. When 2 sets are about to retaliate against each other, an intervention worker who has respect from both sides can sometimes negotiate a de-escalation. GRYD also provides youth programming, job training, counseling, recreational activities, and educational support. The theory is that if you give young people alternatives to gang involvement, actual opportunities, not just lectures about staying out of trouble, some of them will take those alternatives. The 40% reduction in homicides in certain GRYD zones suggests this approach works, at least partially. Then there's the Watts Gang Treaty, a fascinating historical example of gang-led peace efforts. In the past, leaders from different sets have come together to negotiate rules intended to reduce shootings. These agreements typically involve commitments to avoid violence in certain areas, especially around schools and community events. Academic research on these treaties shows they can temporarily reduce violence, but without sustained economic alternatives, the truces eventually collapse. The challenge with all peace initiatives in Watts is sustainability. A mediator might successfully prevent a retaliation this week, but if the underlying conditions, poverty, lack of opportunity, easy access to guns remain unchanged, violence will find another outlet. Programs lose funding, staff burn out, leadership changes, and momentum dissipates. What actually works, according to evidence compiled from various interventions, combines multiple approaches: trauma-informed services that address psychological damage, economic investment that provides legitimate alternatives to illegal economies, credible messenger programs staffed by people who have lived the life, targeted policing that responds to active threats without harassing entire communities. And all of it needs to be sustained over years, not just pilot programs that disappear when grants run out. Watts records 3,670 violent crimes per 100,000 residents. Brentwood, about 15 miles away, sees fewer than 150 per 100,000. That's not a small difference. That's a completely different reality happening in the same city, under the same mayor, policed by the same department. The hyper-localization of crime in Los Angeles is so extreme that you can identify safe and dangerous blocks within the same neighborhood. LAPD CompStat data breaks the city into divisions, and the disparity becomes crystal clear. The Southeast Division, which includes Watts, logged approximately 81,000 incidents annually in recent years. Compare that to West LA divisions serving areas like Brentwood, which record fewer than 15,000 incidents. Same police department, same legal system, but resource allocation and outcomes couldn't be more different. What's particularly striking is that while LA celebrates overall crime reductions, homicides down 14% citywide in 2024, violent crime down 9% in early 2025. Those improvements aren't evenly distributed. Wealthier neighborhoods see dramatic drops. Watts sees marginal changes or, in some categories, increases. The city gets safer on average, but the average obscures the reality that some neighborhoods are being left behind. So why do some areas improve while others stagnate? Investment patterns tell part of the story. West Adams, for example, has seen significant gentrification over the past decade. New businesses move in, property values rise, city services improve, and crime drops. That's the virtuous cycle. Watts experiences the opposite. Businesses leave, property values stagnate, services remain inadequate, and crime persists. That's the vicious cycle. Historical housing policies created these divisions. Redlining explicitly prevented investment in neighborhoods like Watts. Zoning laws concentrated public housing in specific areas. Highway construction in the mid-20th century literally carved barriers between communities. These weren't accidents, they were policy choices that created geographic inequality. Budget decisions perpetuate these patterns. Schools in wealthier areas get parent donations that fund programs and facilities. Schools in Watts rely entirely on public funding, which is often inadequate. Parks in affluent neighborhoods get maintained and programmed. Parks in Watts become neglected spaces that gangs claim as territory. Emergency response times vary by neighborhood. Ambulances get to Brentwood faster than Watts. Quality of healthcare facilities differs dramatically. Access to mental health services, addiction treatment, and preventive care all significantly worse in poor neighborhoods. The result is a city where your zip code determines your life expectancy, your educational outcomes, your economic opportunities, and your likelihood of being a crime victim. Los Angeles isn't one city experiencing one crime problem. It's multiple cities layered on top of each other with vastly different realities. While headlines focus on violence, there's a network of community organizations in Watts doing the unglamorous daily work of prevention. Local nonprofits run job training programs, provide counseling services, create safe spaces for kids after school, and mediate neighborhood disputes. This work doesn't make the news because successful prevention is invisible. You can't report on shootings that didn't happen. Violence interrupters represent a unique category of community responder. These are often men who've served time, who've been in gangs, who've lived the life and came out the other side. Their credibility comes from experience. They're not social workers with textbook knowledge. They're people who survived what current gang members are going through. When they show up to mediate a conflict, both sides listen in ways they won't listen to police or traditional authority figures. The model of wounded healers has proven effective in other cities, and it's gaining traction in Watts. The idea is simple. If you want to reach someone deep in gang life, send someone who's been exactly where they are. These interrupters work in real time, getting calls about brewing conflicts and literally stepping between potential shooters to negotiate alternatives. It's dangerous work with low pay, but the impact can be measured in lives saved. Cultural influence matters too. Kendrick Lamar, who grew up in Compton and has deep connections to South LA, uses his platform to promote peace. His involvement in community events, his music addressing violence and trauma, and his public advocacy carry weight with young people in ways that official programs never could. The Watts Summer Games and similar events bring the community together around positive activities, creating moments of unity that counteract the divisions gangs create. Families who stay in Watts, despite everything, show remarkable resilience. Parents who work multiple jobs to keep their kids fed and clothed. Grandmothers raising grandchildren because the middle generation is incarcerated or dead. Community members who organize block cleanups, who report dangerous conditions, who refuse to let their neighborhood be defined solely by violence. Youth who escape the cycle, who graduate high school, who go to college, who find legitimate careers represent hope that change is possible. Each success story proves that talent and potential exist in Watts, just like anywhere else. The difference is opportunity and support. What all these community actors share is a belief that Watts can be more than its worst statistics. They work without adequate funding, without public recognition, often without seeing immediate results. But they show up anyway, because the alternative is abandoning their community to the forces that want to write it off as unsalvageable. So here's a question nobody wants to ask directly. Can Watts actually change? Or is this just how it's going to be? History provides some answers. Harlem went from a symbol of urban decay in the 1,980 seconds to a gentrified neighborhood where studios rent for $3 grand a month. Parts of Brooklyn that were war zones in the 90 seconds now have artisanal coffee shops and yoga studios. Neighborhoods can transform, but the question is what kind of transformation we're talking about and who benefits from it. The evidence on what works is pretty clear. You need trauma-informed services at scale, not pilot programs serving 50 kids when thousands need help. You need sustained economic investment, real jobs with career paths, not minimum wage positions that disappear after grant funding runs out. You need violence interruption programs with stable funding and credible staff. You need education systems that actually function. And you need all of this maintained over decades, not election cycles. The debate about policing is more complicated than either side wants to admit. Watts needs protection from violence, which requires some police presence. But decades of over-policing, harassment, and brutality have destroyed community trust. The answer isn't simply more cops or no cops. It's fundamentally different policing with accountability, community oversight, and recognition that enforcement alone doesn't solve social problems. Here's what most politicians won't say. Fixing Watts would be expensive, really expensive. The kind of comprehensive intervention needed overhauling schools, creating jobs, programs, funding mental health services, rebuilding infrastructure, providing housing would require billions in sustained investment. Every dollar spent on prevention saves about $7 in criminal justice costs down the line, but politicians think in 2-year and 4-year cycles. Long-term investment doesn't win elections. The uncomfortable truth is that Watts is the way it is because of decisions Los Angeles made over 60 years. The uprising in 1965 didn't create these problems, it exposed them. The response to that exposure was containment rather than investment, enforcement rather than opportunity. Every year that pattern continued, compounded the damage. Current violence isn't random chaos. It's the logical outcome of concentrated poverty, generational trauma, economic abandonment, and systematic disinvestment. Change those conditions, and you change the outcomes. Keep those conditions in place, and statistics might fluctuate, but the fundamental reality won't shift. The future of Watts is ultimately a test of what kind of city Los Angeles wants to be. Data shows transformation is possible with sufficient resources and political will. Whether that will exists remains the open question. Meanwhile, residents of Watts continue navigating a 1 in 5 chance of violent victimization, living with a level of risk most Americans can't imagine accepting.